Hello, and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke, and I am thy host, and today's chapter is Genesis 41. Let's read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version, and while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. We've got a bit of a long one today. Genesis 41 has 57 verses, so let's go ahead and get to reading. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time, and behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is, as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be reserved for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants, and Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, there was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. So that is the text of Genesis chapter 41. There is quite a lot that changes and quite a lot that goes on in this chapter. We see a 180 in the life of Joseph, going from being in a terrible position to being truly one of the most powerful and respected men on the entire earth. Only God can bring about a transition, a transformation like that. Let's remind ourselves a little bit of those years that Joseph spent in hardship. So we kind of picked up on Joseph's story when he's 17, and he's hated by his brothers. So what do his brothers do? Well, they think about killing him, but they decide, let's not kill him. Instead, we'll sell him into slavery. And then we'll kind of just let our father believe that he was killed by a wild animal. So that's precisely what they do. They sell him to some traders who are headed down to Egypt, and Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt. And Jacob, his father, just thinks he's dead, and his brothers let him believe it. So while Jacob and his brothers are up in Canaan, Joseph is down in Egypt, and he's a slave. He's a slave in the household of Potiphar, but he's a very God-fearing, God-respecting young man. He works very hard, even though he's in that terrible position. He works hard for Potiphar, and Potiphar takes notice of this, and he learns and grows to respect Joseph, and he puts Joseph over his entire household and everything in it. Well, that's going pretty well for Joseph until Potiphar's wife decides that she kind of likes the way Joseph looks, and she tries to get Joseph to have relations with her, and Joseph resists her, and he says, "I can't do that. That would be a sin against Potiphar. That would be a sin against God." But one day, Potiphar's wife lies about Joseph and gets him in trouble, and Potiphar, unfortunately, believes his wife, and he sends Joseph to prison. So after working all that time and serving so faithfully for Potiphar, I'm thinking about Potter from the movie It's a Wonderful Life. Potiphar. After he serves Potiphar so faithfully, his reward is that he gets thrown into jail. But what we did admire about Joseph's character is that he still honors God. He still believes that God is with him. He still respects God. He still lives in a way that God would want him to, even though his circumstances are really terrible. He's in prison for a while, and then he meets two guys from the royal household. You remember who they are? The chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And they're in prison because they did something to offend Pharaoh. And Joseph meets them there. And one night they have dreams, and they don't know the meaning of these dreams, so they tell Joseph their dreams, and Joseph, through God's power and insight, is able to interpret their dreams for them. He tells the chief cupbearer that your dream means that you're going to get your job back, and you're going to go back and work in Pharaoh's house. The baker's dream was not so positive. Joseph tells him, your dream means that Pharaoh is going to kill you, and you're going to be hung. And what happens is that when the designated amount of time passes for these dreams to be fulfilled, exactly what Joseph prophesies or interprets comes to pass. The chief baker is hung, the chief cupbearer goes back to Pharaoh. Now you remember, Joseph says to the chief cupbearer as he's going to Pharaoh, he says, hey, put in a good word for me with Pharaoh so that I can get out of this prison because I haven't done anything wrong. But we're told at the end of the last chapter that the chief cupbearer forgets about Joseph. Even though Joseph interpreted his dream for him and, had this incredible moment where this dream comes to pass and he gets his job back, he forgets about Joseph and he doesn't mention him to Pharaoh. So as we open up on chapter 41, we see that a couple years is going to pass before the chief cupbearer is reminded of Joseph's presence in prison and his special ability to interpret dreams. Before we get into our text today, let's go ahead and lay our foundation asking our key questions. These are all on our PDF outline, which you can download for free at tobelikechrist.com. There's also a book available that you can buy on Amazon with all 40 chapters of Genesis and the outlines for the respective chapters in that book if you want to just get it all at once. There'll be links down in the description to both options. The first question we always ask is, when did these events happen? Joseph was 17 years old when he went down to Egypt. According to the timeline that we've been using, that would be approximately 1728 BC, about 1700 years before Jesus, a little bit more. Genesis 41 records events that happened when Joseph was 30 years old. So this is interesting because it tells us how long Joseph was in these terrible circumstances. First he was a slave and then he was in prison. And that period of his life, slavery or prison, was 13 years of his life, from the age of 17 to the age of 30. It's amazing that he remains faithful to God through all of those years. I mean, that's a long time. Our key characters for today, we've introduced some of these already. First, Joseph. He is Jacob's son with Rachel. Joseph's brothers hated him and sold him into slavery, thinking that, we're never going to see him again. Well, we'll see if that assumption is right. We have Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the title that's given to the king of Egypt, the country in which Joseph is in prison at the moment. We have the chief cupbearer. This is Pharaoh's cupbearer who had previously spent some time with Joseph in prison, and Joseph had interpreted his dream for him. And then we have two key names. You're going to want to remember these alongside the 12 sons of Jacob. Their names are Manasseh and Ephraim. These are the sons who are born to Joseph when he's down in Egypt with his Egyptian wife. And now we want to take a look at our map and figure out where these events took place. The story contained in Genesis 41 took place in the country of Egypt, and the stories that we're going to read about in many of the upcoming chapters are going to take place in Egypt. We'll be down here for a while. We were in the promised land, or the land of Canaan. This was the land that God promised to give to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob's descendants. But our story has kind of shifted and moved to the southwest, down to Egypt. We'll get back to the land of Canaan eventually. That's kind of part of the Bible story. How do we get back to Canaan once we shift the story down to Egypt? Don't worry, we'll get there eventually. But our story takes place in Egypt, and we don't know exactly where in Egypt. Egypt is a country, it's a pretty big region of the world. We're not told exactly like what city or what specific place these events played out. All right, so now we go to the second page of our PDF handout. We're going to take a look at our outline section. This is where we break down the 57 verses of the chapter. I've got them broken down into 5 sections for today, and we have to be somewhat concise because there are 57 verses here, and we don't want a podcast that's 45 minutes long. I think that will be somewhat easy, though, because this chapter is not super complex to understand or anything like that. It's pretty much just a straight recounting of some facts that we're going to go over, and we're going to talk about Joseph's significant change in station in life. So our first section is verses 1 through 8, Pharaoh's dreams. Before we talk about Pharaoh's dreams, let me remind you of some dreams that Joseph had. Dreams are significant in the story of Joseph. Do you remember all those chapters ago, actually it wasn't that far back, when we were first introduced to Joseph? What's one of the reasons that his brothers hate him? It's because of his dreams, right? He dreams about his brothers and his family bowing down to him. Okay, so just keep that in mind. I'm not gonna, explain the whole thing to you here. We'll cover that in future chapters, but just keep those dreams in mind as we are talking about Joseph and the change of station that I mentioned. Okay. 2 years after the chief cupbearer and the chief baker's dreams were fulfilled, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, dreamed 2 dreams. When he awoke, he was really troubled, and he called all of his magicians and his wise men and his dream interpreters to help him, but they couldn't interpret the dream. They didn't know what it meant. So what exactly were these dreams? That's what we're going to outline in our second section, verses 9 through 36. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. The chief cupbearer approached Pharaoh upon this dilemma that he was in, and his memory was jogged. He told Pharaoh about the Hebrew boy that he had met who had interpreted his dreams in prison. Thanks a lot, cupbearer, for your remembering Joseph and getting him out of the situation. I do have to say, I really wonder if Joseph kind of ribbed on the cupbearer when Joseph is elevated in power. He becomes the second most powerful in Egypt. It's I have to think that he snuck in a few comments or harassed the cupbearer a couple times about taking 2 years to get him out of prison. I don't know. Maybe Joseph's character was too high for that. Mine would not have been. But anyway, so the chief cupbearer, he goes to Pharaoh and he's like, oh, I had a dream when I was in prison. And there was this guy in prison, a Hebrew, who interpreted the dream for me. Maybe we should go find him. And so Pharaoh summons Joseph from prison. This has to be a shocking moment. Joseph has no relationship with Pharaoh up to this point, and he's probably dirty and not super well kept and not super well shaved, as we find out. And he has to get himself ready super quick to go stand in front of the king of Egypt, one of the most powerful men in the world at the time. So he probably couldn't believe when the message originally came that he's probably thinking, I think you might have the wrong guy, but no. So Joseph puts on new clothes, he shaves, and then he's brought before Pharaoh. Pharaoh told Joseph that he heard that he could interpret dreams. And again, we see Joseph's just fantastic character. Joseph tells Pharaoh that it's not him, it's God who provides the interpretation. So he doesn't take the credit for himself. He says, I'm just a servant of God, and I hear the dreams, and God gives me the interpretation. So that's the way that he leads into this conversation. Pharaoh is okay with that, and so Pharaoh begins recounting his 2 dreams to Joseph. In the first dream, there's 7 healthy cows who come up out of the Nile River. The Nile River is the primary river that feeds all the land of Egypt, and really the whole empire is built around. So these 7 cows, really healthy, really good-looking cows, come up out of the Nile River, and they're followed by 7 ugly, really skinny, hideous cows. The 7 hideous, skinny cows eat the 7 healthy cows. But one thing that's interesting is they don't get fat from eating the other cows. They remain just as skinny and as ugly and as hideous as they ever were. That's dream number 1. Now, in his second dream, Pharaoh says that he saw 7 healthy ears of grain growing from one stalk. But they were joined then by, you guessed it, 7 ugly, hideous, thin ears that Pharaoh describes as being blighted by the east wind, like having wind burn, if you've ever heard of that. The 7 ugly ears of grain swallow up the 7 healthy ears. And there doesn't appear to be any hesitation on the part of Joseph here. Joseph immediately tells Pharaoh that God has revealed the interpretation to him. No rituals, no fancy incense burning or anything like that we're told in the text. Joseph says, God has given me the interpretation. Pharaoh's similar dreams shared the same interpretation. So they were communicating the same thing. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy ears of grain were symbols for 7 years of abundance that would come upon the land of Egypt. The 7 skinny cows and the 7 withered ears represented the same thing, 7 years of famine that would follow these 7 years of abundance. Egypt would experience 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of a very severe famine. And it wasn't just going to be Egypt that was going to be suffering from this famine, but it says the whole earth. So this was a very widespread famine, and nobody was going to have food during these 7 years. And that's going to be a key part of the story moving forward. Joseph then tells Pharaoh that what he needs to do is appoint a wise man to store up food during the 7 years of plenty so that the nation can survive and not starve through the 7 years of famine. He says that you should appoint overseers and you should collect a fifth of all of the grain from the produce of Egypt during the abundant years, and then you'll have that stored away when the famine comes upon you. This brings us to section number 3. Joseph is promoted to power, verses 37 through 46. Well, little did Joseph know when he was telling Pharaoh that, but he was writing his own job description. Pharaoh decides that there's nobody wiser, there's nobody more discerning than the man who's standing right in front of him. Clearly, God is with him, and he's able to give him this interpretation. Why not select this young man, Joseph, for the job of overseeing the land and collecting this food? So he doesn't just make him like any old overseer, but he actually makes Joseph the second most powerful man in the land of Egypt, which instantly makes Joseph one of the most powerful men in the world. And so, as I mentioned, there's definitely a significant change in life status here, or personal status here. Joseph is also given a wife and a new name, Zaphanath-Paneah. Don't worry, we're still going to refer to him as Joseph in our studies, and the Bible is going to continue to refer to him as Joseph, which is slightly easier than Zaphanath-Paneah. You notice he's given a wife after Abraham and Isaac and Jacob went through such trouble to get their wives from shared backgrounds with them, shared values with them from their family, rather than marrying women of the land. We see Joseph here, he's just given an Egyptian woman to marry. But we see that doesn't corrupt his character. He still remains faithful to God and faithful to his work throughout all of his years. Joseph was 30 years old when he was honored by Pharaoh, which makes me feel old because I'm now 34. And, looking back at my life, I was thinking earlier today as I was reading this text, I was like, that's a great thing that God does for him. He elevates him to this great position. And I was thinking, well, why don't I get elevated like this? And the answer came to me pretty clearly, and that is that my character is not as good as Joseph's character. and leading up to my 30th birthday, Joseph was a better man than me and more fit for that role than me. So there I had my answer. Okay, this takes us to section number 4, 7 years of abundance, verses 47 through 52. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph gathered grain in the storehouses, and he was very faithful in this, and the land was so plentiful that it says that Joseph collected more grain than he could even count. It says that it was like the sand of the sea. It was innumerable in quantity, and I imagine maybe for Joseph, who was a man who had managed Potiphar's house so well, who had worked well in the prison for his master, and he was a manager. I imagine maybe counting the grain and losing count would have been somewhat irritating to him, but he did his job so well that he couldn't even count how much grain he collected. And so they're getting ready for the 7 years of famine, and you see their enormous trust in God, enormous trust that what God has said about this dream is going to come true. They don't second guess it. They don't say, well, I know God said this, but maybe it'll be different. Maybe we don't have to do it this way. Maybe we can just enjoy the fruits of these 7 years, and maybe the famine will never come. They don't question God's word, and that's probably a good lesson for us. They trust what God has said and what God has communicated to them, and then they act accordingly. So in every city, they're storing up grain, and the grain in each city comes from the land that surrounds that city. So 1/5 every year for 7 years is taken by Joseph and his helpers, no doubt, and stored up. Okay? So the year before the famine comes, Joseph has 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Now those names are going to be very significant because some of the tribes of Israel are going to be called by those names. In the scriptures that we're going to read in the future, we'll see the tribes of Ephraim and the tribes of Manasseh. That takes us to section number 5, the famine comes upon the world. The beginning of the famine, verses 53 through 57. At the end of the 7 years of abundance, guess what happened? Just as God had said, the famine began. The Egyptians and those from the surrounding nations didn't have any food. So this was a widespread famine, and it was a really bad famine, and very few, if any, people were actually avoiding it. And so everybody, all the surrounding nations, were having to come to Egypt, and there Joseph was selling them food. So Egypt is probably getting very enriched by this, and Joseph is clearly, being perceived as a very wise man for being the one who made this happen, and the God of Jacob is being glorified through this process. It's interesting that if you know the story of the book of Exodus, it's interesting that the God who saves Egypt and who receives glory for saving Egypt eventually has to tear Egypt down when they forget about him. But that is a study for another time. So the famine has just begun, and we're going to be talking about the events that take place throughout the famine as we go through the next couple chapters. This famine is going to cause Jacob and his sons to make some trips down to Egypt. And who might they run into down in Egypt that they weren't expecting to run into? I'll just leave it there for now. But that is our study in Genesis 41. But of course, we have to finish up with an application, so let's talk about that. Joseph proceeded confidently into a task that required God's help to succeed. When Pharaoh asked Joseph if he could interpret dreams, Joseph very confidently replied that God would give him the interpretation. He stated it positively and without qualifiers. And he didn't doubt that God would help him because he was returning that glory to God, not taking it for himself. And I think one of the applications that we need to take away from this story is to have faith like Joseph did. Is our faith ambitious enough to undertake a task that necessitates God's help? Are we ever willing to jump into a situation that we know we are incapable of accomplishing on our own, but we trust that God is going to help us because we believe that that's something that needs done. That's a work that needs accomplished. That's a task that needs completed. And we say, well, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to volunteer for it, and I'm going to trust that God's going to help me. That's precisely what Joseph did here. And the question for us is our faith that ambitious? Do we have that kind of strong faith, that kind of trust in God? Or do we only undertake work that we are confident that our personal skill set can accomplish? If we only ever do things that we're good at and that we know we can accomplish on our own, then what do we need God for? As we've mentioned a couple times in this study, the Bible is not a book about these great men who were just so capable and did everything on their own because they were so skilled and so self-sufficient. No, the Bible is about God using people who are incapable to get glory for himself. And of course, he's going to use those who have faith to step out into situations that necessitate him showing up so that he can receive the glory. Well, the dogs outside have started barking at each other, so I guess that's my cue to conclude the podcast for today. That's our study in Genesis chapter 41. Thank you for joining me. And we have a good bit more to talk about in the story of Joseph, so don't neglect to be back tomorrow, Lord willing, to talk about Genesis 42.